Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show where we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. Today we are continuing with our top 10 lists of underplayed cards in Commander, and today the focus is the color red, one of my favorite colors. As a quick reminder, I will be including in this list cards that I feel are underrepresented in the Commander format. They might be particularly good cards, they might be particularly fun cards, but in any case they are cards that should be seeing more play, and they all have a 3% or less play rate on EDHREC. So without further ado, let's get started with Carlac Fury of Avernus, which is in 6,705 decks or 3% of all decks, and this is one that I just don't understand. Extra attacks are always fantastic in Commander, and this card gives you them extremely easily. It's not color intensive, only one red pip, and if they don't remove it, you get it turn after turn after turn. It's like Aurelia the War Leader, which sees a lot of play, but that's a Boros card and costs 6 mana. This essentially does the same thing and also gives your creatures first strike. That's a lot of stuff packed onto a card, particularly when you consider that you can just drop this as the last creature you play and all your other creatures will still get 2 attack steps that turn. This is criminally underplayed. In only 3% of decks, this should be in way more, and it's still very cheap, so just pick it up and put it in all your decks and enjoy the free wins. Next up we have Chef's Kiss in 7,533 decks or 1% of all decks. Chef's Kiss is an interesting one. I can see why it might be a little bit underplayed because of the randomness to it, but that's part of what makes it great for me. It's a super fun card, but it's also a surprisingly powerful one as well, because it is random, but it crucially can't hit your own things, so it's always going to turn out beneficial for you. It's also really cool that it includes the words gain control of target spell. You don't see that wording in a lot of cards. But anyway, being able to protect your stuff from removal and instead remove 2 of your opponent's things for 3 mana is fantastic in red, because it doesn't really have many protection options, and this just lets you also deal with 2 problems for the price of 1. Just a very solid card that should be in more than 1% of decks. Next up we have Braid of Fire, which is in 7,462 decks or 1% of all decks. Now this one I can maybe understand not being in so many decks because it's an expensive and old card, and it's also a weird one. If you're not sure about cumulative upkeep, what that means is you pay the cost each turn increase. This is a weird one though, because instead of paying a mana cost, you're actually gaining mana. Now back in the day this could have been risky because there was mana burn, but these days there isn't, so this is all upside really. However, you do have to build your deck in a way that you can use this mana, because it's going to be gone after you move to your main phase. That being said, most Commander decks run mana sinks anyway, and if you include this in your deck, it's fair to say that you're going to be building around it somewhat, and you're going to be throwing a few different ways to use the mana in your deck, such as the number 1 on today's list, which is great with this card. It also excels in commanders that have mana sinks on their own, so for example, it's very good in something like Ashling the Pilgrim, which was the first commander that I ever built. Overall, it's a very fun card, but it does require a little bit of build around. Still, it should be in more decks than it is. Next up we have Zariel Arch, Duke of Avernus, which is in 7,234 decks or 1% of all decks. This is one that again I can kind of understand because people are not huge on planeswalkers in Commander, but this one does a lot of nice stuff. First, it's another way to give your whole team haste, which is always good in red, but the 0 ability is what we're really in there for, because having a devil that also deals damage when it dies is actually super useful and can clog up the board really well against other ground-based decks. It also makes it very unlikely for anybody with utility creatures such as Esper Sentinel to attack into you, so in effect it can block a lot of damage. And you can keep pumping them out. We're mostly playing it for the devil ability and the occasional haste. It's just a very solid card, particularly in token strategies. Next up we have Mineclaw Shaman, which is in 4,830 decks or 1% of all decks, and I love this card. This is such a sweet card. Although your meta does need to be playing some instants and sorceries, I think most metas have at least one deck that's going to be a little bit based around that. It's very hard to miss with this really, because people usually have big grips in the late game, and once you get to cast anything for free, this can be so amazing. If you need to wipe the board but you don't have a board wipe, you can go look at your opponent's hand and get the Supreme Verdict from there, or the Blasphemous Act, or if you just want to get some value and draw some cards and do some funky things, you can do that too. This is really good in a deck that can blink it, such as one that's running Conjurer's Closet. It's just a very cool, different card that's going to make for lots of fun moments, which is a great thing to have in your deck. Next up we have Industrial Advancement, which is in 3,696 decks or 1% of all decks. This is another really sweet one from a recent Commander set, and I don't understand why this isn't seeing more play. In basically any deck that wants your creatures to die, this is going to be fantastic. In a bunch of red decks that are playing big stuff and don't mind it dying, then this is really good. I'm thinking about including this in my Rivers of the Claw deck, which you should stay tuned for because the deck tech is coming soon. And I just think it's really cool to be able to sack stuff and then put a creature straight onto the battlefield. It doesn't matter what the mana is. The only thing that matters is if you can hit it in the top X cards. That shouldn't be too hard to do in most decks. At number 4, we have Life of the Party, which is in 3,609 decks, or 1% of all decks. This is just another really fun card. It works really well in most decks. Whenever it attacks, it's going to get +X+0 equal to the amount of creatures you control, so it's obviously good in token strategies if you're running that. And then everybody gets a token copy of it when it enters the battlefield. But they're all goaded for the rest of the game, so they can't attack you until you're the last person left in play. And this is very difficult to block. They can't just block with the creature that they just got because it's gonna have first strike and it's very likely gonna be absolutely massive, and it has to attack. It's a really fun card. It might annoy your opponent somewhat, and it's a little bit worse if your meta is full of sacrifice decks because they can just throw the token away. But in other metas, this can just crush. People are gonna be throwing these huge threats at each other, and you are not going to have to worry about it at all because you're just sitting back there while the other creatures are goaded and they can't attack you anyway. At number 3, we have Viasino Heretic, which is in 3,542 decks, or 0% of all decks. I don't understand this one. I absolutely do not understand how this is in such few decks. This is one of the best ways to deal with artifacts in red, and it actually hits your opponent for damage as well, which is really awesome. It's going to be great in Torwauki or any kind of deck that's based on chipping away at the opponent. It's a little bit slow, but it's not like there aren't ways to run haste in red. And just a repeatable artifact remove that also deals extra damage to your opponent is just really good. The other card is very similar to this, which is also great, is Horde Smelter Dragon, and I feel like that's a little bit underplayed as well. Making it into the top 2, we have Radiant Performer at 2,243 decks, or 0% of all decks. This is a doozy. It's a really, really funky one that requires a little bit of setup and some good situations, but when you actually get this to work, it's going to be the best card in the deck. It can do all sorts of absolutely crazy things, like copying a Chaos Orb, which is going to make everybody groan at the table, but it's going to be hilarious and super fun the first time you do it, because then suddenly you have a Chaos Orb for every single permanent on the table, and it's just basically build your own warp world. It's also effectively a board wipe when you need it to be, so if anybody is playing any spot removal, you just flash this in and then you just get to wipe the board, which is pretty awesome. You can also get really creative with this if somebody's playing like card draw spells that targets only themselves. You can make everybody draw. That can be a fun thing to do at the table as well. There's just so many possibilities, and that's without even getting into the fact that this can copy abilities. That's where a lot of the interesting stuff comes with this card, and that's why it's worded in a way that you have to cast it from your hand, because this could be really busted otherwise. But it's so cool that it can copy abilities. For example, I saw someone mentioning recently that it would be really good to put into the new Zariel deck from Legends Retold, because then you can put an egg counter on all the creatures on the table, and whenever any of them dies, you're going to get an insect and draw a card. That is awesome. Anyway, just a really unique card that can be used in lots of creative ways. And finally, we have Obsidian Fireheart at 1,384 decks, or 0% of all decks in Commander. I don't understand this because I think this card is a really good way to finish off people in red decks that have a lot of mana available, in big red decks. This works very well with the previous card we just mentioned because we can put a token on every land, including your own, though that's a little bit awkward, but still, this is really, really good. It's a really good way to finish off players. It's a little bit slow sometimes, but when you have lots of mana to sink into it, such as with Braid of Fire, as we talked about earlier, or a bunch of different decks that make a ton of mana, there's a lot of those now, and they can all just sink this mana in, and the land is just going to continue to burn. It just deals them 1 damage every upkeep. They can't do anything about it unless they get rid of the land, and that kind of sucks anyway. So it's a very inevitable form of inevitability. It's also really good again in the Torwauki deck that we were talking about before. It's going to be really spicy in that. It just works very well in a variety of different strategies, and it's a great way to finish off games, and I think it should be in a lot more than 1,384 decks. So there you have it. Please spare a thought for these poor underplayed cards and put them in your next Commander deck to brighten up their day. Do you disagree with this list? Is there anything else you think should have been on there? Please let me know in the comments below. I read all the comments and respond to all of them as well. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like or subscribe. I'm currently growing the channel and your help is very much appreciated. And until next time, take care.